and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. This is Irreverent, Faith and Current Affairs.
Welcome back to Irreverent, Faith and Current Affairs with me, Jamie Franklin, and Tom Pelham, TJ Pelham. How art thou this day?
Very good, thank you, Jamie. Pleased to have power back. It's been a funny old weekend, but it's quite wholesome as well in some ways.
Because you've been deprived of power.
Yeah, pretty much from Friday till Monday.
And was that because of Storm Franklin?
Well, I think Storm, the first one, was the first power cut, and then Storm Franklin did indeed. It seemed to undo whatever they'd done to get the power network back up and running again. Because we had a brief period from Saturday afternoon to Sunday morning, Saturday evening to Sunday morning, where we did have some power, which was rather nice. Welcome.
Good. Well, it's the first time I've had a storm named after me, so I'm very pleased.
Nice, isn't it? Yeah,
it's nice to have a storm. Have you ever had a storm? Has there been a Storm Pelham?
I doubt there's been a Storm Pelham. There may have been Storm Thomas, but I've not heard of it.
It might be Storm T-Pel. Well, it's good to be with you, Tom. So today, we're really exciting show today because we've got Laura Dodsworth, brilliant Laura Dodsworth, photographer and writer and journalist coming on. Of course, she wrote State of Fear, which is all about behavioral psychology, but she writes a lot of stuff on her Substack on all sorts of stuff. She's been writing about political totalitarianism in Canada, which we'll speak about, central bank, digital currencies, what it means to preserve the values of liberalism in what increasingly seems to be an intolerant and insane age that we're living in. And I also want to ask her a bit about her views on the whole transgenderism thing, given that she's got quite an interest in femininity, and she actually has she's got a couple of books on this issue, and masculinity as well, where she's taken pictures of men's and women's bodies, and I haven't actually read them, but I believe they sort of talk about what it means to be a woman and what it means to be a man. Anyway, it'll be really interesting because
it will. Well, I really enjoyed. She was very, very interesting to have last time. I think it was one of the most enjoyable guests we've had. I mean, we've had many enjoyable guests, of course, but I think I'm looking forward to chatting to her again.
Yeah. So it's going to be brilliant, Tom. It will literally be amazing. I've got a good feeling about it, and I hope everyone else does as well. Just to say at the beginning of the show, I know I keep banging on about this, but if you like the show, share it with people, rate and review it, and also support the show at patreon.com/irreverent. If you like this show and you think this show is great, I want to do something to show how great I think it is, well then you can support us on Patreon from a small tiny amount of £1.50 plus VAT in the UK per month. We mustn't forget that Patreon do charge 20% VAT, which is outrageous, but there's nothing we can do about it. So,
but I mean, for your, was it 25 pence or so of, no, it's a bit more than that,
£1.50 is 40p, isn't it?
40 pence or something like that. For that entire cost, which is much less than the cost of the coffee, you can help us with our server costs, etc., and show your support and join, of course, the Patreon community, which is a wonderful place of well, we ought to do more. We are going to do more. We have done some more, but that you get the podcast early, and you get to chat with us as well, because we're all on Patreon. So it's good.
It's definitely stuff is definitely happening on there. But also we've got really big plans coming up. Big plans. We can't announce any of them yet because they're not finalized. But the fact that you guys give to the podcast and so generous means that we have options, and these options are really exciting options. Yeah. And you'll see what they are, some of them anyway, very soon. So do contribute to the podcast if you enjoy it. I don't think there are any more notices, are there, Tom? I think that's pretty much it. We try.
That's pretty much it.
Just follow us on Twitter.
I thought you were doing something snazzy with like a pre-recorded notices. Did that not work?
There is a bit of that, but sometimes you've got to say some stuff as well. Twitter, Telegram, YouTube, Odyssey, audio.
Is that where you're reading around podcasts at all? That's good to know. I just it's a craft. Making professional.
Making podcasts is a craft.
Consummate professional.
And I'm a craftsman of podcasts, or a craftsperson. Presumably it's not all right to say craftsman nowadays. These days, Tom, you can't even say craftsman anymore. You have to
on your own podcast as well.
On my own podcast.
You can't say craftsman on your own podcast, right? We've got a Bible reading as usual, haven't we, Jamie? Should we do that?
Yes, we have. Yes. I was going to say one thing we haven't plugged for a while, just one more plug, is our sermon audio, where we put our weekly sermons. It has mostly been me recently, just because I've been too disorganized to ask you.
Do you know what? I struggle with online sermons because there's always a sense of a certain amount of sort of improvisation in my sermons, and a certain sort of spontaneity, which sort of requires sort of people being there to really
well I mean, think of it like a musical performance, Tom. It's like a practice.
I know, but
you're there sat in front of the organ and there's no one else there in the church, and you're thinking, I'm just going to really go for this.
I normally think, I wonder if I can make the people on the other side of the road hear this.
Well, maybe you could do the same thing with your sermon. Anyway, I mean, we're supposed to be plugging the sermon audio. If you'd like to listen to our sermons, you can go to Irreverend Sermon Audio. You can go to irreverendsermonaudio.buzzsprout.com.
They're fantastic.
Just in case you didn't hear that when Tom interrupted the website address the first time. But they're there most Sundays. If we've got something to put up, we'll put it up. It's not as professionally done as this podcast because it's, just as and when we have them, but it is most weeks. So if you'd like to listen to our sermons, please go there.
Or you can come to our churches. It's always welcome. I've had a few people visit my church recently. Yeah.
Was that good?
It was very nice.
Yeah. Oh, that's lovely.
Enjoyable. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's always great to meet people, and that's the best thing, isn't it? Meeting people in the flesh is really great. Another thing I would say as well is, like, if you'd like to email the show, you can at irreverendpod@gmail.com. And I especially love to hear emails from people who have picked us up recently. So we had quite a lot of messages and emails since Lord Frost came on, people who have connected with the show for the first time. And we just love that. We just love to hear people say, oh, we've had lots of people say, oh, we'd lost faith in the Church of England. And now we see you guys up there, you vicars from the Church of England, saying stuff that we approve of and think is good. And it really gives us hope. And that's really nice. I've had a number of messages like that. So thank you. So if you'd like to get in touch and say nice things or critical things.
Critical things are fine.
Yeah, because take it. You criticize me all the time.
I do.
As does my wife. No, it's a joke. I'm not going to say it's a joke. We have a very happy marriage. Right, let's do some Bible reading.
Reading.
This is a text. Actually, I've to be honest, Tom, I've done the wrong reference on the show notes here. So there will be no errors in the public show notes, but for the one Tom is looking at, it's the wrong. I'm going to read from Luke chapter 6, verse 37 to verse 42. And I'll explain why I've chosen this in a moment. But this is the teaching of Christ and the Sermon on the Mount. Now, the Sermon on the Mount comes in two places. I know what you're going to say, Tom. I know what you're going to say.
Sermon on the Plain.
I know what you're going to say.
The Sermon on the Plain.
All right. So, okay, I've heard what you said. So, in the Gospel of Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount is most definitely on the mountain. In Luke, it's on a plain. It appears to be the same sermon. Who knows what it is? Maybe
that's quite an assumption to make. I mean, I think Ian Paul on Sepizzo keeps trying to make this point that there's no particular reason to think that they are the same sermon. They have similar content.
The fact they've got the same content.
Well, they've got similar contents, but he's going to preach the same thing over and over again in different places. I mean, you and I both preach the gospel over and over again. I don't know. He had a 3-year ministry.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. So there we go. There's a little bit of trivia for you there. A conundrum. Is it the same sermon? Is it different sermons? Is there a symbolic meaning to him being on a mountain, perhaps in the Gospel of Matthew, because he's the new Moses, maybe? Maybe it was literally done on a plain, but in Matthew, he's on a mountain in order to make him a bit more like Moses. What do you think,
Well,
Tom?
I think that he's coming down out of the mountains. He could still be on a mountain in Luke. It's just on a flat bit of mountain.
Yeah, there you are. That's resolved.
It's sorted.
Excellent. Right.
But again, it doesn't need to be the same place. It could be different places entirely. Anyway, go on.
All right. Chapter 6, verse 37.
Yep.
The teaching of Christ. Judge not, and you will not be judged. Condemn not, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For the measure you give will be the measure you get back. He also told them a parable. Can a blind man lead a blind man? Will they not both fall into a pit? A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone, when he is fully taught, will be like his teacher. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, brother, let me take out the speck that is in your eye, when you yourself do not see the log that is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out that is in your brother's eye. Now, one of the reasons I chose this is because I'm doing a sermon on it this week, but I also was thinking about this podcast and how it might apply to the kind of things that we talk about in this podcast. So I think it's very clear, Tom, I'm sure you'd agree with me, that the teaching of Christ, there's a very central emphasis on focusing on yourself and your own sin before going out and criticizing the world. So this image, famous image, why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye when you've got a log in your own eye? Meaning you've got much bigger problems to deal with than, your brother's tiny sin over there. You've got all this sin, all this blindness in your own life, and you should sort that out first. And then, maybe after that point, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take out the speck that is in your brother's eye. So there's that, it's in that order. It's not you go around and judge everyone else and never think about yourself, but it's firstly, don't judge other people and judge yourself first, focus on your own sin, etc., etc. So there's that point, isn't it? And I think the point there is that, well, one of the things that this implies is that, we should be people who are humble, because we're aware of our own sin. We should be slow to judge other people. We should be slow to criticize other people, because ultimately, we should be preoccupied with sorting ourselves out, right? And in some ways, there's a chapter in Jordan Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life, which I think is a bit like this, where he talks about, putting your own house in perfect working order before you criticize the world. And so I think, that's a pretty good summary in some ways of what Christ is saying there. And in other ways also, there's a sort of implicit critique of certain types of, social justice movements. I would certainly sort of include the sort of woke identitarian movement in this, where, it's all about the sin out there. It's like all of these people, these are the people who are sinners, and they're actually hurting me. But there's very little introspection. Often it's all about them out there. It's not about me and here and my sin. So, but one of the things I wanted to say about this is I've been thinking about, the people who have been disenfranchised because of the COVID stuff and who have become very, very cynical and perhaps even angry, perhaps even bitter towards political leaders who have done things which have caused great suffering, and have caused people anxiety or loss or whatever it might be. And I think that's the constituency that we've largely spoken to through this podcast. And I suppose my question, and it really is a question at this point, is, how do the teachings of Christ apply in a situation like the one we've been living in and like the one we're in now? How do you negotiate being hurt and wounded and frustrated and angry with the government and, largely speaking, the world around you? How do you negotiate that and the fact that Christ's teaching is to sort yourself out first and focus on your own sin? It seems to me there's a bit of a tension, challenge there.
I don't know. Yes, we're called to sort ourselves out first, but actually, the saying actually does not say don't sort other people out once don't speak to the world. It's simply to acknowledge your own weakness before you help other people with their weaknesses. I don't know. The problem with just taking this as it becomes very passive, whereas actually there are plenty of other places where we are called to use the scriptures to teach, to admonish, to Paul's letter to Timothy. And indeed, it's for me, it's always not been so much about don't judge, but judge with the wisdom that the things, the criteria you judge by will be applied to yourself, and that works both in life and I think in sort of terms of sort of eternal justice. I think Christ is probably talking about both. But in the end days, if you've judged anyone harshly, then you need to be sure that your own judgment, that your own life is clean from that. But Yeah, it's a bit. It doesn't quite say, I don't think we're called to simply worry about our own internal spiritual life and entirely sort that out first. Because the problem with that is you never entirely sort yourself out.
So when Christ talks about removing the log from your own eye, and he sort of, he does imply that it's possible, at least in some sense, to do it, right?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
When he says, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take out the speck that is in your brother's. So, I mean, presumably he's not talking about being absolutely sort of sinless and perfect, but he is saying something there about, I don't really know how else to say it apart from, sorting yourself out, sorting whatever issue it is. Maybe it's in terms of hypocrisy. I don't know. You don't want to be going and saying to somebody, you shouldn't be doing that when you're doing it yourself.
I think there's something to be said for very new believers to being careful, before they've come to understand their faith and grow into Christ and into their position within the church. It can be really tempting to be quite critical, and actually that it's important to remember that we're all on a journey, I guess. There's something of that, but obviously, to some people, Christ gives the authority to do all these things, to judge, to forgive on his behalf, it's part of church leadership and church discipline. So it has to be read in combination with that, because some people I've seen use this as a sort of as a get out of jail card for church discipline, effectively. You're judging me.
Yeah, I mean that's a slightly different issue, isn't it? I was more thinking about just generally in the Christian life, the place of judgment. I think it's pretty uncontroversial to say that there's a very significant warning here on the part of Christ.
Yeah.
If you are going to judge other people, you need to realize that, as you say, Tom, you're going to be judged with the same level of judgment, and also you want to be absolutely certain that you are not being hypocritical in the kind of judgment that you're using.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I suppose, just in terms of the political stuff, I think the teaching of Christ here is at least to some extent a corrective, because I think one of my reflections on the past couple of years has been just that at points I've been absolutely obsessed really with the political situation, and in many ways I don't really sort of blame myself for that, because it was a totalitarian situation for us, which means that politics takes over your life and it controls your whole life, and you become obsessed with it, you become preoccupied with it because you can't get away from it. But I think there's a calling here, there's a gentle and benign and loving calling from God through the words of Christ to come back to the basics of discipleship, the ABC of discipleship, which I don't think is about being really angry about political situations in the world. It's about repentance. It's about me coming before God and repenting and thinking, well, actually, the world out there may be corrupt and people out there may be sinful and wrong, but ultimately, my main preoccupation, what I'm called to do, is to focus on my own sin and repenting and growing in holiness, regardless of what's going on out there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, that's why I deleted Twitter.
Yeah, well, that's definitely a good step.
Delete Twitter
in terms of moving towards greater levels of repentance. Let's have our email.
Let's move on swiftly on.
Yeah, we should, because we need to just say something about the Bishop Sarah's statement on the end of COVID restrictions. Email. I found Lord Frost summing up of the Church of England's woes sadly to the point, exact, precise. How many lost sheep are looking for a way into the green pasture? The main gate is, however, blocked by a dislocated cultural ensemble of notional men of God intent on arguing for a cause of social collaboration that excludes the very essence of expression of God's narrative. We are all unique and made in his image. I honor your courage to stand up for the gospel, the teachings of Christ, who understood his position of authority from whence it came. The parish system, although ancient and no doubt reflecting the cultural might of a church to influence via a feudal system, does inform us by each spire just how significant the tenets of Christianity are to our culture. The sharing or stretching of a priest as an ambassador of God highlights the watering down of values through disengagement and worldly principles. Without offence, I've reluctantly decided that for me, the corporate Church of England, directional leadership outworked in parishes, leaves a bitter taste of betrayal of New Testament prerogatives. I'm sure you'd heartily endorse such a notion, Tom. Where is the priest teaching the congregation, equipping them as disciples? Where is the hope of salvation, not submissive socialism that corrupts our standing in God's eyes? You are both very brave, and I wish we could come under your pastoral cover, even though we are in North Yorkshire. I've got no plans to move to North Yorkshire.
No, I mean, only after you've been to Aberdeen, surely.
To Aberdeen. Oh yeah, well that was all I did. It was funny. I realised sometimes my sense of humour is a bit dry for people who don't know what Tom was talking about. I made a joke about moving to Aberdeen, which was totally sarcastic, and people started emailing me saying, "Oh, you're moving to Aberdeen? Oh, I didn't know this." I mean, I've got I don't want to go to Aberdeen. North Yorkshire is lovely though.
It is nice. It is good.
And thanks for the email.
It's lovely. It's an interesting one, isn't it? I think. Yeah, there are bits which I understand, and there are bits which I'm not entirely sure I understand. But
in the email, you mean?
Yeah,
I think it's just basically a criticism of the Church of England, isn't it? Really, mostly.
I'm not sure what the cause of social collaboration that excludes the very essence of God, expression of God's narrative is. I don't know that.
It's probably talking about things like the climate change agenda and
right. Okay, I see. And the sort of this false idea that the kingdom of God is something we build. It's not something that's built in us.
Yeah.
By grace. But yeah, okay, it's a good one. Where is the priest? Well, if you wanted to move to Burwash, hopefully you would experience those things. I'm sure you would in Nottingham as well.
It's quite a long move though.
It's a big. There are some people from Yorkshire here. They're very welcome. They feel at home.
That's good.
That's
good. Yeah. So no, that's kind of what they're saying. I mean, I think it's very clear what this person is saying. They're very much sort of coming from a similar. They're talking about the kind of watering down of the parish system as being a kind of indicative of a metaphor, a loss of conviction in the importance of the priest, ministering in word as sacrament, and all that kind of stuff.
I mean, I agree, and I think for me, the thing they don't mention, which I think certainly does need to be mentioned, is how the shutting down of the churches really, I think, showed a complete lack of faith in the idea that we need more than just, the famous, man cannot live by bread alone, but by every word that comes forth. That actually we're spiritual beings that need to meet, and that word that comes forth, the only way you can consume it spiritually in the Eucharist. And the sort of complete lack of confidence in the salvation of Christ through the ministry of grace that is the church meeting in this particular form on earth. And so I agree. I don't feel very brave though, to be honest, because I just do what I feel called to do. So thank you for your kind words, but we'll manage.
Yeah, I mean, I feel the same. Like, this isn't, the vicar of Baghdad here.
I'm not likely to be dragged over to an Oxford high street and burnt like those great Reformation martyrs, who, luckily, we're not in that world. But the slings and arrows of cancel culture I can take because I'm not on social media anyway. But thank you. And Paddy, no, sorry, I shouldn't say that, should I?
Well, that's okay. First name's okay. It's all
right. Thank you, and I hope that you find a priest who will minister to you in North Yorkshire.
Yeah, me too. Right, let's move on to the
Bishop of London. Whoa.
Well, so all the COVID restrictions have been lifted in England now, which is great. Obviously, we hope it carries on this way. Tom, I won't get you to read this out because you'll fill it with little comments. I'll read it out and then you'll comment on it. Okay, so Bishop Sarah Mullally, who's the Bishop of London, says, who's the chair of the COVID recovery group for the C of E, she says, the Prime Minister's announcement that COVID-19 restrictions are being lifted holds out the hopeful prospect of the end of the pandemic, but will nonetheless raise concerns for some. The last 2 years have challenged us again and again, but also taught us how we can do many things differently and heightened our awareness of how we transmit.
Can I just say, I mean, this is uncritical acceptance of the idea that we've done things differently and that we should have done things differently this time. I mean, honestly, it's it's complete. It's just guff, isn't it? It's nothing. But also, we don't need a heightened awareness of how we transmit disease to each other. That's not helpful. It's not how humanity functions. It's not fullness of life. We're not just. It's almost as if all she sees are disease bags everywhere that are just spreading it. It's not useful.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's carry on.
Yeah.
People have made huge sacrifices, and I would like again to say thank you to our NHS and frontline workers, our clergy. You're welcome. Parish volunteers and congregations for all you have done. Your actions. What's that?
I think it's our clergy, parish volunteers, and congregations, because otherwise it makes no sense, does it? I don't know. Well,
I mean, does she mean
all hers?
Does she mean our clergy, not other clergy? What about the other clergy? What about the Roman Catholic clergy? Anyway, carry on. Your actions, whether noticed or unnoticed, big or small, have been the glue which has held our communities and our nation together during this time of great need.
Well, it's nice that she's recognised irreverend, isn't it?
Yeah, has she? Where's that?
Well, it's our actions.
Okay.
Have been gluing a community together, haven't they? Our listeners, hello.
Yes. Well, yeah. I mean, I'm not sure she's totally aware of our existence, but maybe she is.
Maybe.
I recognise the pandemic has had a major impact on people's well-being, and the need to look out for each other is as great, if not greater than ever. Now, there, I would want to say something, which is that, it's not necessarily the pandemic, in inverted commas, that has had a major impact on people's well-being, but the measures that have been taken to combat the COVID-19 virus, which have caused a huge amount of suffering for people. So I don't like this euphemism of saying the pandemic has done this, because it's not actually the pandemic most of the time. It's the restrictions and measures that have been taken by governments, as we made that point before.
Yeah.
Although the legal restrictions are being lifted, there may be good reason for us to take some measures as individuals and as local churches. I'm conscious that some people with medical conditions will now be more fearful that compulsory isolation for those who are likely to be infectious is ending. We should not lose our focus on the most vulnerable. We've much to be thankful, not least the vaccines, which have been a real answer to prayer. They are more vital than ever, both here and around the world. And I think that's the end of it.
That is the end of it. I mean, hopefully it's the last one she ever puts out. But there's a couple of things in those last two things. I mean, for one thing, is people with medical conditions who make them vulnerable to COVID are exactly the same people who've been vulnerable to everything else in the past. It's not a new thing for them. There's nothing. As before, the same level of compassion needs to be there, but there shouldn't be. If we're returning to living with this like we lived with the flu, then this is not helpful. It's only going to make people more fearful and more hesitant to begin life normally, which is what we need.
Yeah, I mean, for me, Tom. Sorry, go. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Well, and then the vaccines is a real answer to prayer. I mean, the first thing is there's almost a denial of officiousness of prayer in there, isn't there? We prayed a lot, but here's our first real answer to prayer: vaccines. The second one, of course, is, as we pointed out again and again, there are grave ethical problems with the use of human fetal remains in the production testing of all the vaccines, and that actually it's not simply enough just to say that they're unequivocally good, or indeed an answer to prayer. They're human things. They're made for profit. They're forced on people with coercive measures. They are then arguably vital is an interesting question, more vital than ever, really. I think they're less vital than ever because Omicron is manifestly milder, and but the church should be talking about the unethical coercion that indeed some people in the church have put on people to take vaccines that most people, even ignoring the ethical problems with them, most people do not need.
Yeah.
So that's awful. I mean, that's really awful.
Yeah, I mean, I think also, Tom, again, you want something, we've much to be thankful for, not least the vaccines. As a representative of the Christian faith, you'd hope for something a little bit more specifically Christian, wouldn't you? That's just the way I feel.
Yeah.
When we talk about hope, for example, or whatever it might be, as Christians, we have a hope which is greater than, vaccines. But having said that, Laura Dodsworth is here. So let's admit her into the room now, the virtual room, and we will be connecting with Laura. Presently, it's just connecting to the audio at the moment on the computer we've got here. So the anticipation is building. We can just see Laura's name at the moment. She'll be here presently. We can hear now, but we cannot see. Laura.
Hello. Oh, hang on. There we go.
There we go. Hello, how are you doing?
I am really good. It's lovely to be with you again.
Yeah, it's great to be with you. So just so you know, this is all going on the podcast, Laura. So, you know.
Okay, I'll get myself together.
Yeah, so just,
right.
You know, I mean, we like, you know, unguarded comments and, you know, passion and things like that, but just so you know. So Laura, great to see you. Great to have you on. How have you been doing since we last had you on in the summer last year, didn't we, I think?
I don't know about you, but I'm genuinely quite confused about time now. I tried really hard to keep it together for months, but eventually certain things start influencing you, you know, lockdowns, not living your normal life, having the Euro 2020s and 2021, and
that was very strange.
So was it in the last summer or the summer before that we spoke? I don't even know. Last summer.
It was about May, wasn't it? It was May of last summer. So it's just after your book had been released.
Right.
I think. Which was, when was your book released? March, April.
May 21.
It was May. So it was around then. So it's 8 months ago.
Yeah, I know what you mean though. I mean, I can barely remember, but that was, I mean, it was definitely a while ago. And you'll have noticed that we've, you know, massively upped our game here on the podcast. You know, conversational style is hugely developed, and, you know, various other things I'm sure you'll notice as we go along. But Laura, like how I mean, I've been seeing stuff on your Substack, so you've been doing that. Presumably you've been promoting the book. I've seen your media appearances and stuff. So is that mainly what you've been doing, or have you got other stuff brewing, or how have you been spending your time?
You've just created a slight feeling of shame in me. I don't feel like I've been generative enough. I think that the book had quite a long tail, more than I was expecting, but that's because I often don't let myself think about how much work will be involved in something. I actually don't really like book launches very much at all. I don't enjoy them. I really don't enjoy it, all the scrutiny and the media appearances, the interviews, yourselves accepted, you're lovely. In a way, I just want to get it out there. A bit of praise would be nice, and then move straight on to the next thing, but that's not how it works. So I actually have started writing another book, but otherwise, you're right, there's been a lot of, I've written quite a lot of articles on the themes that are in the book, and been doing interviews about the book. And I started a Substack. That was partly so that I could just write whatever I want every week without having to get an article commissioned. And that's been occupying me, but yeah, mainly I'm trying to get into a new book as the restrictions have eased, actually, and we are hopefully on a path back to some form of normality. We should talk more about that, what normal, old normal, true normal, real normal, new normal means. I feel myself needing to create and to generate again. It doesn't suit me personally to be following agenda and being on a hamster wheel of news, because that's just not how I'm built. I need to create and be original. So I feel myself kind of losing interest and detaching from some things. I don't look at any COVID data anymore. I'm not interested. I need to move on and do something new. So that's where I'm at, writing a new book, but I can't tell you about it. I'd have to kill you and all your listeners.
Well, that'd be horrendous. I mean, that would be absolutely awful. Yeah, but I mean, I know what you mean. I feel a very similar way actually about the COVID stuff. Like, as the restrictions end, I mean, maybe this is a kind of selfish thing, but as it becomes less kind of pressing on me personally, I do find it less interesting. And there are still, I think one of the things I wrestle with a bit, and I do feel a certain sense of obligation to the people who listen to this podcast and people who are connected with us, is there are still lots of people who are very, very worried about it. And they really feel like this is just a lull, you know, it's all going to come back, you know, this is all part of the plan, etc., etc. And I'm not saying I'm completely dismissive of that stuff, you know, totally, but I do find it harder to engage as it becomes less and less a part of normal life. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point. Are we losing interest because we're personally less impacted? I mean, it would be natural for that to be part of the case at least. But I don't think it is that. I think it's because we're in tune with the fact that, everything, every story has an arc, and we're on the downward part of this arc. It's okay to be detaching from it. But it's also about where, how can you best be of service? If I think about, write about and talk about the same thing forever, who am I serving? I'm not serving anybody, least of all myself. You have to be true to who you are. I find myself more emotionally engaged maybe with what's going on in other countries where they're still mired in much stricter responses to the pandemic. But it depends. So while the Coronavirus Act in this country, will go and restrictions are being eased, I am preoccupied with what we're left with. And we're not left with lockdown, and we're not left with vaccine passports, but what are we left with? Who are we at the end of this? We've changed. Or perhaps we understood more what the illusory quality of life was before. And I'm worried about muscle memory. I'm worried about how much more manipulable people are than I thought. I'm worried about how our governments respond to things. I'm worried about our relationship with governments. And I think about things that are coming in the future, but they're not necessarily about COVID. They're more about how the terrain was so fertile for the authoritarian response we had to COVID.
I think that's really a good way of looking at it. And I was reminded of the lockdown sort of language actually when we got the warnings from the Met Office about the storms last weekend.
Oh yeah,
and the sort of way they couched their advice as a quite firm sort of requests almost. And I was thinking, well, who are they to do anything other than tell us how fast the winds are? Tell us the risk level, and then we can make our minds up. But there were things like, the press reported things like, the Met Office have advised people only to make essential journeys, and that sort of language got me a little bit. I don't really like the term, but triggered me in the sense because it felt quite lockdowny. I got very grumpy for a bit.
You triggered them.
I was triggered. I got very grumpy, stormed around the house, and then had a cup of tea. And I think there's a sense in which that even if the government have taken a step back, have our institutions learnt far too much about enjoying power? The bureaucrats, the sort of the arcane workings of the civil service. I think we probably need to have a conversation as a nation at some point about that. But it's the problem. On the other hand, is that as people naturally step back from it, they get less interested in it, and I very much doubt that you'd find 100 MPs to get grumpy about it anymore because it's not in the papers anymore.
Yeah, it's a good point. I also felt a little triggered. I could feel my blood pressure rising when I saw one of those illuminated roadside signs. Now, around here for ages they said the same thing. They started off alarming and then they became wallpaper, didn't they? Stay home, protect the NHS, save lives, blur-de-blur, stay safe, or whatever they were. I don't remember now because they became very irritating wallpaper on road journeys. And one of them on that day of the storm changed to necessary travel only. I thought, hang on, Buster, I'll be the judge of whether my journey is necessary or not. Yeah. You tell me how, about the wind speed, like you say, and I'll decide where I'm going and if it's necessary. And if roads need to close or train lines need to shut because trees fall, well, so be it. But I don't know if you saw, but there was a radio phone in, I think it was on LBC, and they managed to find some listeners who were saying there should be mandatory stay-at-home orders during storms. Yeah. So, there is a bit of a feeling of, oh my goodness, what have we become? The safetyism culture's has gone nuts. But I think it's really important to not let go of concerns about what's happening to our culture and how we move forward, even when it doesn't feel like it's a pressing need anymore, because personally our circumstances are better. I mean, I'll be giving evidence at an APPG next week about behavioural science. And I've followed up with letters and doing what I can. So the kinds of themes in my book, where I can, I've pushed in different directions to know that I've done my duty in areas where I've gained some knowledge and expertise and have an interest.
Yeah.
But you have to carry other people with you. They have to have the same interest.
It's going to be much harder. I mean, obviously we've got a cohort of people who are with us, but it's always that 40% in the middle, isn't it? You know, I said there's a number plucked out of nowhere, but you know, if we think of sort of 30%, you know, who are rabidly in favour of government authority, and and the sort of totalitarian responses to even the smallest things, and you've got sort of maybe a 30% who are always going to be inclined against that. It's the people in the middle that were swayed one way and now seem to have come the other, but they're not going to be stuck with that. You know, if it's not directly affecting them, and to be honest, it will continue, obviously, to directly affect them as inflation continues, as the government continues to mismanage gas prices, and you know, tries to declare war on Russia in order to stop people getting upset about parties. But you know, it's the narrative of there needs to be a narrative of smaller state, dismantling of the institutions, reversing of political correctness and safetyism, and if we don't get that momentum behind it, then we will end up here again, won't we? There's no doubt about it. It's the only trajectory that we'll see. Yeah.
I think so.
Go on, Laura.
No.
Go on, Laura. People want to, not me.
Well, some of the topics you suggested to talk about today are very much along those lines. So, you know, you suggested, should we talk about the truckers in Canada, the freedom protest? I found that very inspiring.
Yeah.
Of course, not everyone feels the same. I think if you lived in downtown and you're listening to horns honking, it would be really flipping annoying. And if they're blocking up trade roads, arterial roads, of course it's inconvenient, it's damaging to the economy. But what I really took objection to with this protest was freezing bank accounts. And not just the bank accounts of truckers, but the bank accounts of people who donated to support the truckers. Yeah. And I think that's a really concerning trend, and that's one that you know could migrate. It could migrate beyond the borders of Canada and go to other countries. I don't want to see that in any country.
Yeah.
I don't want to see it in China. I don't want to see it in Canada. And I definitely don't see it here. Canada's a country I always used to want to go on holiday to. And weirdly, I have no interest in going to Canada now. I think of them as... it's true. The last couple of years has changed where I want to go in the world. I think of, at least a percentage of the population is quite barking mad. I don't like the look of the government and the police. I think that they treat freedom as casually as we've seen in certain Middle Eastern countries, so it's a lot less appealing to me as a country. But it's a very sinister move to cut off somebody's access to their own money, to basically freeze their property. And you know, here in the UK, the Treasury and the Bank of England have task force looking at central bank digital currencies. So that's a kind of digital money, and one consideration is, should it be identity based? And that would open up the sort of action we've seen in Canada very easily here. You know, your money can be related to your identity, and it could open up a form of a social credit system like China. That's the kind of thing I look at when I see the response in Canada, and it's what worries me.
Yeah. So I mean, there's a direct link there, isn't there, between the COVID thing and this issue of central bank digital currencies, because this is still, in some ways, in Canada, this is all being justified in the name of this ostensible ongoing pandemic, right? So there's this ongoing pandemic, we've got all these mandates, and then the truckers go against the mandates, but because this is, these are extenuating circumstances, Trudeau is able to invoke these emergency powers, which putatively justify his freezing people's bank accounts. So it's directly related to the situation with COVID. But as you say, it is quite worrying because it sets a precedent whereby it becomes an acceptable thing in a supposedly Western liberal democracy to steal people's money out of their bank account, if you're the government. And one of the things I think people don't sort of think a lot of the time is like, should a government be doing that? Should they have access to your money? Should they be able to even, why would that even be something that is the case? Sorry, Laura, go ahead.
Well, I don't know what their legal options were for dealing with protests. Most countries have laws already to deal with protests like that, just like here in the UK. There are laws to deal with difficult protests. Why not use them? Why not bring in new emergency powers that lead them to freeze bank accounts? This is it is honestly a genuinely totalitarian move. Seizing property normally happens a bit later on in totalitarianism. This is quite an early show of the hand, I think. So if you had a digital currency, it could be more fine-tuned than that. Instead of freezing all their money, it could be that your money only allows you to travel so far because you can only fill up your vehicle with so much fuel. In the future Internet of Things, maybe your car will talk to the petrol pump. It could be that you have different rates of tax and interest applied to different people. It could be that you can buy some products and not others. The options are quite limitless, really, if you have an identity-based central bank digital currency. And I had huge reservations before, but now I've got even more concerns because our government hasn't condemned the actions of Trudeau's party at all. They haven't said anything about freezing bank accounts of protesters and the people who donated to the protesters. They're basically redefining what they consider terrorism to be in order to do this. And it's just self-evident where the problems could be, because it could be applied to any form of protest or dissent in the future. It's a really slippery slope.
I mean, it's been, the obvious thing there's a similar kind of thinking of terror laws, the way that the councils in the UK use, I believe, powers given to observe people and to follow people and to trace people that were supposed to be used for terrorist and other sort of major crime, but actually ended up being used for things like bin collection, minor faults. It's obvious that once a organisation gives itself power, it's always going to use it as much as possible. It becomes convenient. It's much quicker. It's much quicker to be able to bypass the rule of law.
Laura, something I'm really interested in this article that you've written about this on Substack is when you talk about liberal values, you write, for example, we're no longer engaged in a fight against a virus, but a fight for liberal values and against despotism. And on one level, that's very straightforward. But then the thing that sort of complicates it slightly is, well, I suppose it's sort of epitomized in Trudeau himself, who he's not, some kind of jackboot wearing Adolf Hitler lookalike. He's a man with long floppy hair who talks about, including everyone in society, who talks about the need to not be prejudicial towards minority groups, and to have, at least he sort of espouses at least ostensibly socially progressive political views more generally. What's going on here? How have we got a situation where we've got a man who is basically a sort of totalitarian, but at the same time he's espousing these, ostensibly socially progressive viewpoints? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I think it's a massive disappointment on a really shallow level. When he first came to us, I thought, cool, he's dishy. Oh, lots of women did. Lots of women thought Justin Trudeau was dishy. Do you remember the picture
right?
of...
he looks like a schoolboy to me. He looks like, really skinny and small to me. But what is the face, the hair?
If you say so, no. I mean, but he he couches it in that language, but now I don't trust him at all, and I don't think those values are progressive at all. It's couched in the language of inclusion, but he just gave a speech now that the protests are dispersing, and he said things like, "You can't attack journalists." Who that's
can't?
very. One can't. He's referring, I suppose, to the truckers. Maybe the truckers were verbally abusive to some journalists. Okay. I'm not sure what he was basing that on. Except I'd already seen a clip on Twitter of a Rebel News journalist being beaten with batons and shot close range by a tear gas canister. So you can't attack journalists, except the police. Policing the protests can. And he talks about it being a time for healing and recovery. But the reason that they're there protesting is because their bodily autonomy and their rights are threatened by the vaccine mandates. Whether they individually want to be vaccinated or not, the protests started because they didn't agree with the mandates for crossing the border. So how are they supposed to heal and recover? They're not being given the opportunity to protest and have their views respected. I think he's a deeply nasty, illiberal, despotic person, and he just tries to use the right language in order to subvert supposedly liberal ideas to bring people with him. He says he's constantly talking about keeping Canada safe. Well, this is the language of tyrants, because it's alarmed people who follow a strong leader to safety. He also has described the truckers, with every name under the sun. He's called them misogynist, Nazi, anti-vax, racist,
Islamophobic.
But the cat's out the bag. We've all seen footage of them. We've seen lots of different ethnic minorities. We've seen filming of them dancing and singing in the streets and laying flowers down before police officers. This isn't some ragtag bunch of renegade supremacists. So he's using language that should bring liberals along with him. Oh, we don't like those people, so that's why we're coming down hard on them, because we don't like that sort of person. But it's a subversion of the liberal ideals, because that's not who they are, and in fact they're just exercising their liberal right to protest.
But there's two sort of definitions of liberal going on here, aren't there? I mean, there's liberal in the way that I consider myself to be a liberal, a sort of classical liberal, I guess, which is all about personal autonomy within a society of tolerance, I guess. And there's liberalism as the sort of political force that has sort of mutated in places into things like BLM, into things like the sort of the trans wars that seem to be going on, about the right of people to be to hold views about sort of sex that the mainstream disagrees with. It's not liberal in the old-fashioned sense, but it is liberalism, and I think he is. If Trudeau isn't liberal, he is certainly part of that liberalism, isn't he? And there are others. Macron in France would be another one. These sort of globalist liberalism, I guess, that doesn't seem to have roots in the sort of 19th century. But comes out of the early 20th century communist and Marxist kind of politics, doesn't it? Is it a rebranding of that, do we think? I mean, I wonder whether he's actually whether he's just making evident the authoritarianism that is at the core of the liberalist kind of agenda.
I think so. I'm not really very well versed in Marxist and postmodern literature, to be honest, but I don't think there's anything inclusive or genuinely liberal about him. It's telling you what to think, and I, as someone who considers myself to be a classic liberal at heart, I think that's really offensive, telling me what to think about these issues. It's very... We should come on to the transgender stuff, but it's very post-truth, and it forces you to lie in order to not be socially excluded or derided, and that's not right. I think that in the last couple of years I've had an ideological midlife crisis. I don't know what my politics are anymore. I don't see right and left as meaningful in any way at all. I think that we really need to go back to basics on our values. What are our values? what do we want the role of the state to be? I feel like I want the role of the state to be much, much, much smaller.
Yeah.
I don't want it to be interested in whether I'm happy or frightened, telling me what essential travel means. I would like it to keep the borders free from missiles and clear up the potholes in the road. Not really much else. I'm having kind of a backlash to it. I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but my views on the role of the state have changed completely. Perhaps I'm a libertarian anarchist now. I'm not sure.
I was going to say, I think the key. I don't think you're necessarily an anarchist, because you're talking about a role for government, which wouldn't be anarchy. There would just be a limited state. But I think the key political distinction, which is meaningful, is between individualism or some kind of form of individualism, let's say, and collectivism. I think that those are, so the word liberal, I agree with you, Tom. It's too fuzzy to really have any proper meaning, and I think that's the thing. So that's the thing that connects the COVID thing and, for example, the transgenderism thing, because they're about some form or other of collectivism. So with the transgender thing, or with any other type of identity politics, it's about placing the individual's identity within the context of a group primarily. So that's the way you see yourself, like I am a gay person, or I am a trans person, or even I would say I'm a woman, primarily, rather than you are an individual who is also a woman. And that's a very significant difference to, I would say, the kind of emphasis on the individual that, broadly speaking, has come to us. I would say, it finds its historical origins in Christianity, but it finds a kind of political articulation in the kind of political liberalism that Tom was talking about. But I think that's really the key distinction, that we're moving towards a much more tribal sense of identity. And
how does that play with you, though, Jamie? Just to push back slightly, how does that play with you in our call as Christians to find our identity in Christ? And is that not just another facet? I mean, shouldn't people be allowed to find their identity in whatever?
In a liberal... Your identity isn't subsumed into Christ. You're still an individual before God, and you're still, for example, in Christianity, there's a very strong emphasis upon the responsibility of the individual for his or her own actions, right? Which we don't in that tribal identity. It's not that you can do whatever you want, but it's that your actions are seen in the context of the group that you belong to. And this does actually come back to this thing about, identity politics or transgenderism, because it seems to me now that we're moving away from a vision of, say, equality before the law and equality or equal treatment, let's say, more generally, and more towards this view that whether or not you are guilty or in the wrong is based at least partially on your identity. So the truckers, for example, they are terrorists because they are white working class men. Now the BLM protesters, they were freedom fighters because they were at least ostensibly minorities.
Yeah, most of them were white middle class.
That's as may be, but they were seen to be that. So I think that's a really serious problem that we're facing.
Yeah, people have taken a really partisan approach to these protests. A few people criticised my Substack article and said, well, you wouldn't stand up for Extinction Rebellion or Insulate Britain or BLM if their bank accounts were frozen. I'm like, hang on, I absolutely would. I don't agree with anybody's bank account being frozen because there's a protest. Yeah. Nobody. And in fact, people called for Insulate Britain's bank accounts to be frozen. Yeah. I was in an interview with Mike Graham on Talk Radio. Love Mike Graham. And he said their bank accounts should be frozen. I said, no, they should not. You should never freeze someone's bank account for being at a protest. Well, certainly, it's very dangerous.
It's not the sort of thing, it's normal crime. If they are causing a breach of law, then that should be dealt with in the normal way, shouldn't it? I mean, there should be no special bank account freezings. You wouldn't take a robber and freeze their bank account whilst they're on bail. A
fine, perhaps, that's appropriately set according to their income. But of course, we've gone crazy with fines in the last 2 years.
£10,000.
Some of the fines for £10,000, which can break somebody. It can absolutely break them, and that is the point. It's supposed to strike through into your heart because it will break your household. But we have never set fines like that. They've always been based on a certain percentage of a reasonable income.
I believe that you're quite right that they were. That's why they were there. I believe that not one of those fines was kept at that level once it went before a magistrate. So if you appealed it and didn't pay it, then every single time it was dropped to an income one, because magistrates can't set fines of just randomly £10,000. It was a weird collision between two different things. The fixed penalty notices were supposed to be small fines that were given out quickly without the sort of accompanying mechanisms of state having to be involved in order for small things. You make those enormous, you get in the weird situation where you get a smaller fine by going to the magistrate than you would by staying with the police.
But that's a risk. Not everybody wants to take that risk of standing in front of a magistrate, because you have to get that far before you get your fine reduced.
I know.
Most people will just want to pay the fine so that they don't have to go through that incredible stress and anxiety of going to court.
No,
Can I segue from something? You were talking before about the individual and the collective, and I think this is really interesting. I set myself a challenge of writing about this for my Substack, and it's taking me ages to write it because I've read several books and been thinking about it a lot, about the collective versus the individual. And I'm sure you'll have heard Professor Matthias Desmet's theory of mass formation. Yeah. So he is somebody who's basically arguing that we're in a time of mass hysteria, which I would contend seems true intuitively. And I'm not a psychologist though. However, you can't really evidence mass hysteria. Nobody can say definitively it has happened or it has not happened. Now, mass formation actually comes from Jung, who talked about mass hysteria and psychic epidemics, and he's the first person who coined the term mass formation. And he would say that in order to avoid mass hysteria, you must self-individuate. The individual has to find meaning. That could be through your relationship with the divine, it could be through social connections, it could be through your work. Yeah. But it's about being strong and self-reliant as an individual. And it seems to me that during lockdown, which itself atomized us, we were also asked to negate the self, because it's selfish to put yourself before the group, before the collective, because an infection spreads through a group. But in a way, that was a sort of a dangerous premise, and I think it's made us more open to mass hysteria and more prey to dangerous ideas which have spread, like an infection. Yeah. And this also ties in with something I wanted to talk to you about the church. Yeah. Because I've been quite startled by all faith leaders being so strong on the vaccine. Yep. So I think the Pope said it's an act of love to be vaccinated, and it's immoral not to be vaccinated. And the Archbishop of Canterbury also said it's immoral not to be vaccinated. Yep. And I thought, where is the room in there for individual conscience? Yep. Because the vaccines are quite controversially developed by researching on replicated cell lines from aborted fetuses. Yep. So now these are fetuses which were aborted decades ago. And they're replicated cells. We're not talking about a fresh fetus, and it's not in the injection. But for some people, that would be a matter of conscience. Now, I'm not a Catholic myself. I don't have any kind of reason to have a religious exemption on that. But I thought it was really strange. This is the first time that people were asked so strongly to lay aside their individual conscience. You know, in war, you can be a conscientious objector, but it didn't seem that religion made space for conscientious objectors with the vaccine. And I wondered what you think about that.
Well, I mean, it's obviously a huge shame that we've got this situation where we've got Pope Francis and Archbishop Justin, who are the ones who are pronouncing on this, because there would be people in the Roman Catholic hierarchy, and there are people, probably fewer people, I would say, in the Church of England, who would have a sophisticated enough grasp of the issues to be able to talk about this in a sufficiently copious way.
Actually, I mean, there are materials from the Catholic Church that do talk about it in a sophisticated way, and they it's the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith did a big thing in 2017, I think, a big paper on the use of and they present a nuanced moral case, and they come down on the side of in the case of most vaccines on the case of people being ethically allowed to use them if you're Catholics. However, they make provision in it throughout the argument for conscience. You're quite right. So the materials are there for the Pope to draw on. That's his own Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith. They work for him and publish documents. And the Church of England don't really bother with such nuanced thinking, but they've linked to that same document and effectively endorsed it at least once. I've seen somewhere. But again, Archbishop Welby, when boiling down the issues, fails to make those nuanced arguments. And there is a nuanced argument. The argument essentially goes a little bit like, we're at third hand from the original crime and sin of the abortion at this point, and so therefore the culpability is lowered, and if the risk is high enough and the culpability is low enough, a balanced argument can be made ethically for taking it. However, the conscience argument's always there. Now, I've said this before, and I say it again. It is the biggest issue with the vaccination, the drive, the coercion, has been the lack of conscience. You don't even have to have a religious one. If you don't fancy it, that should be enough of a reason not to have it, because we have bodily autonomy. But in the end, conscience needs to be followed. The Bible's, it's God's way of talking to us directly.
Yeah. So, but to answer your question about the Church of England, Laura, I think that we do have people who are capable of, like Tom just did, articulating something like that. Why do our spokespeople sound like, everybody else at the top of our
state mouthpieces?
Yeah, exactly.
State mouthpieces, maybe.
It's because the Church of England, at least at that level, at the episcopal level, is another example of institutional capture, where certain people are promoted if they say the right things. And what you have to do is you have to just keep saying the right things over and over again, and eventually you'll be put in a position by the people who have their hands on the levers of power. Eventually they will put you in that position, and then you can carry on saying that stuff. Now, I don't want
turns out unfortunately the right things are not repent and turn away, for the kingdom of God is at hand.
That would be an ideal situation, but in all seriousness, you've got and I don't want to go on about it, it's just a good example. The Bishop of London, she was the head nurse, so she had a very, very senior position in the NHS. Now she's the Bishop of London, which is the third most senior position in the whole of the Church of England. Now, what she says as the Bishop of the Bishop of London is not very different, I would imagine, to what she would be saying if she was still the chief nurse. There isn't very much theology in it. There's not very much which is specifically Christian. And I think that's a good example of the way that what you need to do if you want to ascend the ranks in any of these organizations, be it the NHS, be it the church, or be it any other kind of institution, the police, for example, is you just have to say this stuff. You just keep saying it, and then eventually someone will put you in a position where you become a mouthpiece. And it's very sad, but I think that's basically what's going on at that level in the Church of England.
It's interesting because you see, Jung talks about how religion can help people evade mass hysteria, because you have this other moral guidance to follow, and your relationship with the divine is one of those meaningful connections that can help you self-individuate and stop you from succumbing to a psychic epidemic. The problem is when religion is so close to the state that the leaders are state mouthpieces. Yeah. I find the idea of taking my moral guidance from Archbishop Justin really objectionable. I'll probably upset people here now, but I think of him as an empty vessel.
You won't upset us, don't worry.
But it's embarrassing, the idea of taking moral direction from him, and it's a huge turn off. I feel like I've had, as well as I might be oversharing, but as well as a political, ideological midlife crisis, I've been going through something of a spiritual crash in the last couple of years as well, because it's made me think so much about what it means to be a human, what is human nature, that everything that you think you hold dear and take for granted just turns on a dime. so easily, so quickly. And I'm not saying that a pandemic doesn't warrant big social changes, but it just felt like more than that. It feels like we've lived through a Milgram experiment in obedience, or an Ash experiment in conformity, and we've seen how people respond in authority and to authority in a way that I found quite disturbing.
I think the key really is that in the past, when we've had pandemics, that the natural human reaction has been adequate and hasn't even really needed to be engaged. We know what to do in a pandemic. If you don't want to get sick because you're already sick, you stay out of the way. And if you've already had it, you can act as you've moved on, and you can move into the next stage and help those who are having to isolate. That sort of stuff happens naturally. What happened is the governments entirely lost faith in human nature and in the sort of natural collectivism, which would have been enough. We know it would have been enough because it was enough in Sweden, it was enough in Florida, it was enough even in our first wave because it was peaked already before the restrictions came in. So I think, and that's been the thing, is government has lost trust in us. Why should we now trust it? And that sort of there's a catastrophic breakdown in that. And I think that comes across in the leadership of the Church of England as well. They don't trust us. Why should we trust them? And they don't seem to trust Christ, certainly, or at least.
Well, if your religious leaders don't talk about God and the divine and afterlife and how you truly take sustenance from each other, if instead they shut the doors and tell you what you must do to your own body in order to be moral.
Yeah.
Okay, the church has done that before. You know what I mean, though. Then I just don't see the church as a source of morality now. Yeah. One of the most striking images from the last 2 years is seeing vaccine saves emblazoned on Christ the Redeemer in Rio. I just can't get over it. It used to be that faith saved.
Yeah.
And I think that the church's days are numbered, because if you tell a congregation they don't need to come for a couple of years and do normal services, then they're not really going to see the need to come back. And
yeah, I mean, a lot depends on. I don't want to be flippant, but I mean, a lot depends on God, and whether or not He exists and all that kind of stuff. But I mean, what you're saying is absolutely right from a straightforward point of view. It's not the best marketing strategy to say, that the thing you want people to do, the product you've got, as it were, is actually not worth engaging with. I mean, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, I think that the audience that we have on this podcast, is at least some evidence that there are people out there who are looking for serious theological or religious or spiritual conversation about how to respond to what's been going on, and that hasn't, and that in the absence of that coming from more established, I don't really know how to describe it, respectable sources, they've looked to us instead. And to others like us. So that's definitely there. I mean, I would say that I think, because of Christianity's emphasis on individual responsibility and as Tom said, conscience, and the importance of conscience and the primacy of conscience, the fact that we've been told by these people that this is a moral obligation, I actually think that that's abusive. I think that's an abuse of spiritual responsibility and a fundamental misunderstanding of who we are as human beings before God. If we have a fundamental objection to something, say for this reason, which I do, it's not the only concern I have, but I certainly have a concern about this, then it would be absolutely immoral and wrong for you to do anything else but to reject the vaccine and not have it. And I think the reason that hasn't been said is because there's been this overwhelming desire to be seen to be good in the eyes of the world. And I think it's a very dangerous path for the church to
never goes well for a church. I do think, on the other hand, that you're right, Laura, in that it has, there are. It's been quite easy to lead churches out of restrictions. And in churches, even there have always been people who, I think, there is a rich seam of people who have seen this for what it is, a sort of madness. Unfortunately. not very many ministers seem to be in that. But then it's a complicated matter of responsibility to law and can, et cetera, et cetera. It's not always easy. But I do honestly think that there has been a pushback from the pews, and that it's quite easy to lead people back out of it, easier maybe than other parts of the world. The other place, of course, which has been relatively normal, have been the pubs, which is great. But ever since you could, they've been all completely normal, without. And I wonder whether something of Phil Sarker's a priest who we spoke to a few months before we spoke to you, and his mantra always was that it's the working class that are going to lead us out of this, and there's something of that, a proper sort of that they've been immune to this panic of the middle-aged boomers.
Well, I don't think you should homogenise them all as feeling the same. I don't think that's true. But that also makes me feel a bit sad, because the truckers, of course, in Canada are working class. They're by definition they're working class, and look, they're having their bank accounts frozen.
By middle-aged boomers. It's
pretty sad. Yeah. Anyway, I feel really bad, guys. That's 2 podcasts now. I've given you a hard time for the performance of the church in the pandemic, for which you're not responsible.
No. But it's absolutely right. I mean, we do the same. We do the same thing. It's absolutely right. You don't need to feel bad. But Laura, I do want to ask you about this issue specifically around. You wrote before you were a leading light in the the anti-lockdown world. I suppose you still are a photographer, but you wrote books and produced books about photography, or photographic
anti-coffee table books.
Anti-coffee table books, very good. And one of them is about you've got one on femininity and one on masculinity.
I do.
They're there.
All right. Yeah. Am I allowed to show a nipple on your podcast or not?
Fine, don't worry. We're all very relaxed.
That's the first one. Yeah. It's about breasts, and then there's manhood about penises, and womanhood about vulvas.
Right, there we go. Well, that's the first time that word has been said on this podcast, which is first time for everything.
Which one? Oh, I can bring you lots of new words. I do that. Nipple,
actually, when I did
penis, and vulva.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, probably we've never said any of those 3 words. When I did English language A level, I remember a specific class where somebody made the point that there were far many more rude words for a lady's bits than for a man's. That this was an example of sexism in language. So I don't know whether you think that's true.
I don't think it is true. I haven't counted. I haven't done a quantitative assessment. But of course, the words for a vulva or a vagina are much more despicable. If you think about the worst word in the English language, I will not grace your podcast with this word, because I've said it on Radio 4, but I'm not sure you want it on Irreverent.
Yeah, it's the most.
Everyone knows what I mean.
We know which word.
It's the worst pejorative in the English language, and yet, of course, it's an altar to pleasure, and it's where life comes from, and it's just part of a woman's body. And if you think about the worst words for a man's penis, none of them come close in terms of hatred or disgust.
No,
they might mean you're a bit silly, but they're not. They don't mean you're a despicable person.
Yeah, they tend to be funnier words, don't they?
The point I think we're sort of missing now is that these are all physical realities, aren't they? And we've sort of talked a little bit about transgenderism, and is that where we were going with that, Jamie? I wonder.
Well, yeah, it was. I was going to raise this issue of this advertising campaign that's to do. Who is it? What is it? The New York Times.
New York Times.
This thing, I'm not entirely sure what it means, but this is advertising hoarding, which has a picture of I think it's a black lady, and it says on the front of it, on the foreground, Liana is imagining Harry Potter without its creator. And of course, this speaks to the kind of outrage over J.K. Rowling's pronouncements about womanhood, which, to be fair, are quite, in some ways they are quite nuanced, because she's not coming out and saying the kind of things you would hear, I don't know, somebody like Douglas Murray saying. She's trying to make a subtle subtler point, I suppose, about the difference between sexual identity and a gender identity.
She's been very gentle compared to Douglas Murray, but she hasn't received. I mean, the criticism reserved for either is entirely different.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I've interrupted you.
Go ahead. Go ahead. I want to hear what you've got to say. Go on.
Well, I'll have to collect myself because actually this ad made me. It made me really angry on a few levels.
Do you like Harry Potter? Are you a Harry Potter fan?
No, I didn't enjoy the books or the films.
Oh, that's a shame.
Sorry, I didn't. They're too long. They're too long for me. Yeah. But I respect them as magnificent feats of creativity that have given a huge proportion of the world genuine pleasure. My boys liked the films when they were younger. It's just not really my thing. Yeah, sure. I'm more Star Wars.
Okay, great. I like that.
If that positions me. Yeah. Okay.
That's fine.
Okay. So first of all, when I use the word Leanna, I want to make clear that I'm considering her to be an avatar for the New York Times because Leanna is a character in an ad. I'm not talking about that woman who's been photographed and being mean to her in the things I'm going to say.
Yep.
Now I'm going to unleash on Leanna. Okay. Leanna needs to get a life and get a brain. I mean, how dare she imagine the creation without the creator?
Yeah.
J.K. Rowling is a woman.
Yes.
And she's a creator. I'm going to call her a creatrix. She's a phenomenal woman. She's come from being, a very poor single parent. She has written about her own experiences of domestic abuse. Okay, she knows all about being a woman. She's pushed a baby out through her part that we can't say. Okay,
that which must not be named. That's a Harry Potter reference.
Yeah, exactly. Or I could just say her vagina, which there goes. There's another word for your podcast. That one's okay.
That's fine.
So she deserves nothing but respect for having created this amazing world that's given pleasure to millions, and an enormously successful self-made woman. But Leanna doesn't like her, presumably because J.K. Rowling believes that biological sex is real. Leanna doesn't explain. She's just imagining a world where J.K. Rowling doesn't exist. It annoys me as a woman, it annoys me as a feminist, and it annoys me as a fellow creative because there is far too little respect paid to creatives. I mean, I myself have been plagiarised a number of times. It's really painful. It's like, go on, if you're so good at ideas, go and have your own.
Yes.
You can't imagine Harry Potter without the person who created Harry Potter. Yes. So it's incredibly annoying and it's spiteful. It's a really spiteful ad. It's a spiteful and deliberate blow at a female creator. So presumably Leanna's all about busting the binary. If you've watched the full video, there's something about binary, gender, blah, blah, blah. Don't remember the exact lines.
Yeah. Yeah.
So she's really woke. She's really woke, but she's in an ad which is deeply sexist.
Yes.
It's hypocritical, and it's supposed to be. I mean, how dare the New York Times try to erase a woman out of existence because they don't like her views? So you have to be quite dim to pretend that the creation exists without the creators. So the New York Times is setting its stall. It wants dim-witted readers who basically enjoy a spiteful blow that is being deliberately struck at a woman who very vulnerably shared her story of domestic abuse when explaining part of her background for believing in biological sex. Can't believe we need to defend believing in biological sex, but here we are.
Yeah.
And there is nothing progressive about following the fashionable herd, and that's what the New York Times is doing. So the end of that ad says it's independent journalism. It's not independent to follow the herd like this. There's nothing independent about it. They're welcome to all their dim-witted readers.
Yes.
I don't have a subscription, but if I did, I'd cancel it.
Well, there's certainly no beating about the bush there. With that answer, Laura. So thank you, Tom. You need to go.
I need to head off. Yes, apologies. Well, thank you, Laura. It's been a delight again. Thank you for joining us with all your words. Daniel will have to get a list out because I'm certain as an ex-Roman Catholic, he's probably not heard all of them. So yeah. Thank you, and I'll leave you to continue this discussion with Jamie. It's something that we spoke a little bit about last week, actually, and some of the issues around the church's consultation to conversion therapy, about coercion, but also about biological realities, which I think the church is getting really tied up about, because the church really likes to be liked, and this is something which is impossible to be liked by everyone about. I'm not quite certain how it's going to help its sort of evangelical drive, because the people who like to deny biological realities of male and female are not the people who are going to sort of pop into church next week if we pander to them enough. But it's a real live issue within the church as well as within society, that I think is deeply worrying, because in the end we're called to truth, and we're not called to allow fiction. And when you end up with a sort of a binary being busted by sort of how many genders does Facebook offer now, a multitude of fictional potentialities that say nothing about who someone actually is. I think it's a very dangerous path that society is taking.
Well, this playing devil's advocate here. The thing is, I agree with what you're saying, but some people say the church doesn't have any hold on truth, because if you don't share the same faith, some of what you believe in isn't truth. It can look like fiction, like sky fairies, transubstantiation. Is that truth?
No.
Or life after death, is that truth? If people don't necessarily hold on to those truths, they hold on to their truths of gender, but biological sex is true. If you take the example of Leah Thomas recently, who's won
the swimming, yes, 22-year-old.
Yeah, and used to be on the men's team. Now, when Leah won one of their races by something like half a length, and frankly, I thought it was embarrassing. I mean, for me, if that was me, let's say I identified as a child and I was competing against children, and I won by half a length, I'd think standing on the gold medal podium and taking my award would be embarrassing, because I'd have cheated. So I don't actually know how that individual can take their award. It is embarrassing. But you know what? While the women are competing with Leah, then they're just going to have to accept their silver and their bronze. And actually, people need to refuse to play. And that's where we're at with that. Leah can say they're a woman. But I think everybody watching that is going to disagree that it's a fair competition. Because if you've been born a man and you have a man's body,
you're different.
You are at an unfair advantage compared to the women, for whom the women's category was created to enable them to compete and be in sport fairly.
Absolutely, and I think that goes without saying that that if those records are allowed to stand, then no woman will ever be able to hold the record for swimming.
Goodbye women's sport.
Well, exactly. Goodbye everything. You may as well just say, okay, we're just going to open everything to everyone and not have different sexes in sport. And in which case,
I think women will still keep some gymnastics categories, but not many. It's goodbye women's sport. And don't forget as well, in the US, this matters more, that scholarships are given for sport as well. So that's goodbye your scholarship places.
And I think I should sort of add, just before I go as a last word, is that I don't deny that people feel the way they feel. We can't stop that. I cannot deny that someone feels that they're a woman even though they're born in a male body, and you can have sympathy on that, and I think everyone should. You can be respectful and polite, and I think everyone should. But that doesn't extend to that you cannot extend that fiction to everything. They shouldn't be allowed into women's rape centres because those are particular places for traumatized women. They shouldn't be allowed to compete in women's sport because that is a category that is for women who are born as women. They shouldn't be allowed to claim to be mothers because that's a category that's only achieved through the most privileged and most ultimate expression of womanhood, the power of creation and nurture, that cannot be seized by someone who's biologically male and shouldn't be allowed to be. So to treat them by all means with compassion, call them what they want. I mean, in a sense, but pretending that they are woman when they were born a man, or that they can truly inhabit femininity, despite the fact that they're male physically, is a fiction which is not helpful for them, I think, and it's not helpful for society.
Well, I think they can inhabit femininity, because femininity is just an idea.
Okay,
it's
sorry,
a construct.
womanness. I mean, they can't.
Womanness, yes.
If you want, I was looking for the word, but they cannot. I'm a man. I can never be a mother. I can never put myself in that position. I cannot experience it. Therefore, I cannot. Even if I thought I was a woman, I couldn't ever actually be a woman, because I'm not. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
You're right. Femininity is a construct.
Tom, there's an issue there with language as well. I mean, I know you need to go.
I've got to pick up my son from childminders.
Okay,
I've actually got to go. But
we'll finish up here.
Bless everyone.
Okay,
nice to see you.
Thanks, Tom.
Bye-bye.
I know. I was just going to say, Laura, about the issue with language. I mean, I don't really want to go down that rabbit hole, really, because it's something that people have talked about a lot. I think one of the things I wanted to ask you about, we'll finish in a second, but as somebody who's spent time paying attention to women's bodies, this whole thing, I mean, say you were to take it all on board, and say, well, biological sex is not a reality, or at least it's not some kind of tangible reality of any importance. And really what's important is somebody's gender identity, and that's essentially what they are. It kind of, for me, it raised the question, well, where does that leave the human body? And all of this stuff that that you mentioned, sports, for example, or being a mother, these are all things which are to do with the physical reality. So I guess, that's kind of my question for that sort of ideology is, or that viewpoint is, where does that leave your body? Does that mean does it mean your body is just, well, it doesn't mean it's not important, does it? Because people change their body to kind of match their gender identity. I don't know if you've got any thoughts about that.
I think that, well, my thoughts underwent 180-degree change while I created the books Bare Reality, Manhood and Womanhood. I included people with different gender identities in the books. First of all, I don't discriminate against people. I'm interested, I'm curious, and it was supposed to be a collection, a compendium of totally different types of bodies and feelings about them. And I wanted to collect and curate lots of stories. So I wouldn't have excluded people. I mean, that said, each time one of the books came out in the series, I'd get complaints, mainly a lot of love, but there'd be trans people that would be angry about the way they'd been included. And I heard from a couple of gender critical feminists, somebody said, you can't call it Bare Reality 100 women, their breast, their stories. It's Bare Reality 99 women and 1 man, their breast, their stories. Okay. Actually, it was 2 men, if you look at it like that. They'd miscounted.
That's not,
and I saw where they were coming from. But it's not a neat title anyway, is it? You've got to have a bit of artistic license with titles and headlines. But while I started the projects really open-minded and thinking, oh, well, what's this going on then? Because I started those photographs and interviews in 2013, before this really became as big as it is now. Yeah. But by the time I'd finished, I thought, well, much as I've got compassion and respect for everybody who was trans or non-binary in the project, I came to believe more in the truth of biological sex. I think that how people feel and their identity should be respected, but you can't change the truth of the body. So I think people have got a bit mixed up in the language while trying to fight for rights, and ultimately that's harmful to their case because it's just not truth. It's not. I don't think it's going to end up washing. Yeah. Let me think, what's a better way of putting it? You see, what is gender? When you ask people what gender is, it's quite hard to explain. What do you mean by gender identity? It's just about how you feel. Well, how we feel changes all the time. Do I feel feminine? No. Well, sometimes I am, I paint my nails and wear makeup, but do I identify as a woman? I don't even know what that would mean. I just am a woman. I have a woman's body and I've got my personality inside it. Yeah, absolutely. And you've got boys and at least a girl, haven't you? Is that right? I've got 2 boys.
Okay, so you've got 2 boys. Well, I've got 2 boys and a baby girl. And, for me, the difference, so my girl, well, I suppose she's not really baby anymore. She's 18 months old. But, it seems to me that when you're a parent of young children, the reality of biological sex is just, it's so clear. You can't ignore it. It's not just about the way they physically are. It's about the way they behave as well. It's about gestures and things like that, which are just completely different. And there is a sense in which I can see Mary, my daughter, as having feminine, I don't even know how really to describe it, but sort of feminine gestures and things which just flow naturally from her being a girl. Now, again, I wouldn't want to say that, like, no male would ever have similar type of gesture, but it's such a stark difference between her and my boys. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it can do. We don't. It's hard to deconstruct what part of that is acquired from having watched and learnt people. How much might be genetic, traits that she was just naturally going to exhibit because she's your daughter or your partner's daughter, or because she's female. But I know that I, as a female, have attracted attention and experiences in my life that I would not if I were male.
Yeah,
that can't be rewritten. And I've menstruated and had gynecological problems and given birth, and I have only done that as a female, and that has brought joy and it's brought difficulties, and those are female experiences, and you can't overwrite being male or female. So sometimes people like to bring up intersex people, or more accurately known as having development of disorders of sexual development, DSDs. But having people who do not fit absolutely neatly into a category doesn't mean the categories aren't real. Whereas gender is something, you can have multiple genders, an infinite number of genders, because it's just about how you feel, their feelings. It's not actually biological reality.
Yep. Okay. No, I mean, that makes sense. Laura, I'm aware of the fact that I've kept you longer than I said I would. So I think it would be good to wrap things up there. But it's been so good having you on. I mean, there's so much to talk about, but it's always fascinating to hear what you have to say. So you've got your Substack, which is lauradodsworth.substack.com. Does it have a name, your Substack?
No,
it's just Laura. Name. It's just Laura Dodsworth. So people can find you there, and obviously you've got State of Fear. Is there anything else you'd like to call people's attention to?
Anything to flog at the end? No, not really. When you invite me on your podcast, I just feel like I'm chatting to some really interesting guys in your living rooms, and
well, that's very kind.
You I just want to turn it around actually and ask you questions about religion and God, and I no. Nothing to sell at the end. It's just been a pleasure to talk to you as always.
Okay, you know what I'd like to do at some point, and I don't want to put any pressure on you, but you've come on twice now, so I'm assuming that this isn't the worst thing in the world for you. But we should at some point do an explicit conversation about spiritual stuff, about God, about Christianity, whatever you want to talk about. How's that sound? Do you want to do that at some point?
Oh, what? Where I ask you about things?
Yeah, whatever. Yeah.
Interview you. Yeah, great. And something we talked about in the last podcast actually was the role that the church could have in reconciling people and offering healing. And I'm sure that something is being planned top down from Archbishop Justin, so that's going to be dreadful. And I'd love to see what you can do, grassroots coming up, because there's got to be a place, surely, for churches in the recovery stage of the pandemic.
Yes, I think you're right about that. I mean, we did talk about that, didn't we? I mean, to be honest, it hasn't become anything more than thoughts in my mind, but I think you're certainly right. Speaking of the Archbishop, have you come across his series of interviews yet on Radio 4?
I am meaning to listen to them. I saw the one advertised for Tony Blair.
Yes. Well, that's next week. So that's the one we're all waiting. We're waiting with bated breath to hear it. So it just sets my teeth on edge even thinking about it. So I have to listen to at least one, and I'll save myself for that one. Yeah.
What do you think about it? Anyway.
What I was going to say is about the series. I've only listened to half of one, which is this kind of Middle Eastern novelist lady. I mean, look, Laura, I have to be reasonably careful as to what I say, but it was pretty much exactly what I expected it to be. I don't know if that says enough.
Fine, that says enough for me. I think we all know what you mean. Yeah,
exactly. But I'd love to have this conversation about God and etc. at some point. That'd be really, really good, and give you free reign to say whatever it is that you want to say. And if you want to ask me questions, if you're interested, I'm very, very willing to answer them. So, let's do that at some point. That'd be really
We'll
good.
turn the tables. That's my natural habitat, being on the other side. So
that would be fantastic. I'd love
brilliant.
to. Let's arrange it. Great. Okay. Well, Laura, seriously, thank you so much for coming on. And to everyone else, thank you very much for listening. And we look forward to being with you next week. Until then, have a great time and God bless.